You know how the US loves to use economic sanctions to kneecap rivals? Just cut off the tech, starve the industry, watch them fall behind. Well, buckle up, because the story of US chip sanctions on China is basically a masterclass in how to take a country that was already dependent on your tech, apply maximum pressure, and accidentally create a semiconductor powerhouse that might actually eat Silicon Valley's lunch. I'm not exaggerating. In 2018, China could barely make 14 nanometers chips. They were buying almost everything from Intel, Qualcomm, TSMC. Fast forward to 2025, and SMIC, China's state-backed foundry, is pumping out 7 nanometers processors. Huawei's new phones are running on domestically designed Kirin 9000 chips that Washington swore were impossible without American technology. The iPhone's market share in China is tanking while local brands with local chips surge. The US set out to maintain a permanent semiconductor lead of at least 2 generations. Instead, they ignited the biggest industrial mobilization since the Manhattan Project. The sanctions that were supposed to freeze China's tech advancement for a decade accelerated it by that same amount. The global chip map is being redrawn, and the Valley's monopoly? It's cracking in real time. Let's rewind to 2018. The Trump administration drops the hammer. Huawei gets added to the entity list, cutting it off from American chips, software, and even the ARM architecture it needs for smartphone processors. The message is clear: China can be a player, but not a leader. They can assemble iPhones, but not design the brains inside them. The logic seems airtight. Semiconductors aren't just about money, they're about decades of accumulated expertise, proprietary architectures, and a supply chain so complex it crosses 70 countries. A single fab costs $20 billion and needs EUV lithography machines that only one company in the world, ASML in the Netherlands, can make. And ASML's machines use American components, giving Washington a chokehold. The sanctions tighten in 2020. SMIC, China's biggest foundry, gets cut off from anything below 10 nanometers. No EUV machines, no advanced etching equipment, no design software. The Biden administration doubles down in 2022 with the CHIPS Act, which on the surface is about rebuilding U.S. manufacturing, but the real teeth are in the export controls. They pressure Japan and the Netherlands to join the embargo. The message to Beijing is brutal: you will never catch up. Accept your place as a second-tier tech power. This isn't just economic policy, it's technological containment. The same playbook they used on the USSR during the Cold War, but with more sophistication. The problem? The Soviet Union didn't have a $17 trillion economy, 1.4 billion consumers, and a workforce of 4 million STEM graduates per year. China isn't trying to match the US system, it's building a parallel one. Here's where the sanctions start looking like a massive own goal. In a linear world, cutting off Huawei from Qualcomm chips means Huawei can't make phones. In a complex system, Huawei spends $30 billion on a crash program to design its own processors, build its own supply chains, and source from non-American vendors. The first few years are brutal. Huawei smartphone sales collapse globally because they can't get Google services or 5G chips. SMIC is stuck making 14 nanometers chips for appliances while TSMC pumps out 3 nanometers iPhone processors. It looks like the sanctions are working, but systems adapt. China launches the Big Fund, a $150 billion state investment vehicle to bankroll domestic chip companies. They start poaching Taiwanese engineers with 3x salary offers. University programs in semiconductor design multiply overnight. Every Chinese tech company gets the memo: if you want to survive, you must indigenize your supply chain. The breakthrough comes faster than anyone predicted. In 2023, SMIC figures out how to make 7 nanometers chips using older DUV machines in a process called multi-patterning, basically exposing the silicon wafer multiple times to achieve the same density as EUV. It's less efficient, more expensive, but it works. Huawei's Mate 60 phone launches with a Kirin 9000 processor made entirely in China. The U.S. Commerce Department is caught completely off guard. Tech experts who swore this was impossible are suddenly scrambling to explain how it happened. The answer is simple: desperation is a hell of an innovator. When you cut off a nation of 1.4 billion people from the technology they need, they don't just give up and say you win. They reinvest, recalibrate, and rebuild. The sanctions also had a radicalizing effect on Chinese corporate strategy. Before 2018, companies like Xiaomi and Oppo were happy to use American chips. Why not? They were the best, and profits were good. But now, using US tech is a liability. What if Washington decides you're next on the entity list? The rational business move is to develop domestic alternatives, even if they're initially inferior. The market dynamic completely shifts from buy the best to buy the safest. This creates what economists call a captive market, 800 million Chinese smartphone users who will reliably buy locally made devices. That's more than enough scale to fund rapid iteration and improvement. The first generation of Chinese-made chips might be slower, hotter, less efficient. The second generation closes the gap. By the third, they're competitive. The US essentially forced China's entire tech sector into a war economy footing. And war economies are remarkably effective at achieving breakthroughs when the alternative is extinction. Alright, let's get nitty-gritty technical, because this is where the story goes from they're trying to oh crap, they actually did it. The holy grail of chip making is EUV, extreme ultraviolet lithography. These machines from ASML use light at 13.5 nanometers wavelength to etch features just a few atoms wide. Without EUV, conventional wisdom said you couldn't reliably produce 7 nanometers chips or below. ASML was banned from selling these to China, and they cost $200 million each anyway. SMIC got creative. They used older DUV, deep ultraviolet, machines that operate at 193 nanometers wavelength, but they ran the silicon wafers through the lithography process multiple times in a technique called multi-patterning. Expose, etch, repeat. It's like trying to paint a detailed mural with a thick brush by doing multiple passes. It's slower, it wastes more silicon, it reduces yield, but it works. In 2023, SMIC started mass-producing 7 nanometers Kirin 9000 chips for Huawei's Mate 60 Pro. Tech Insights, a Canadian research firm, did a teardown and confirmed it. These were genuine 7 nanometers processors made without any American technology. The phone even supports 5G, which Washington swore Huawei couldn't do without US components. Huawei didn't stop at smartphones. Their Ascend 910B AI chips are now training large language models in Chinese data centers, an explicit challenge to NVIDIA's dominance. The performance isn't quite a 100 level yet, but it's close enough for government work, literally. Chinese AI labs that can't get NVIDIA's best chips due to export controls are building clusters of Ascend chips instead. The supply chain indigenization goes deeper than most realize. Yangtze Memory Technologies, YMTC, is now producing 232-layer NAND flash memory, competitive with Samsung and Micron. They did this after being cut off from American equipment. Nora Technology is making etching equipment. AMEC is building deposition tools. SMEE is working on lithography machines. The entire stack, design, fabrication, equipment, materials, is being rebuilt from scratch inside China. This is the thing about complex supply chains. If you close off the top end, you don't kill the industry, you grow a new supply chain. It's like cutting the top off a tree. You don't kill the organism, you stimulate new growth from the trunk. The quality gap is closing fast. SMIC 7 nanometers yield, the percentage of usable chips per wafer, started at maybe 15%. That's terrible compared to TSMC's 90% plus. But Chinese fabs are iterating rapidly. Each quarter sees improvements. And here's the key, they don't need to match TSMC tomorrow. They just need to be good enough for the Chinese market, which buys 60% of the world's semiconductors. That's more than enough scale to fund continuous improvement until they do match TSMC. The US strategy was based on a fundamental miscalculation. They assumed China's tech sector was fragile. It's not. It's backed by the full might of the state, fueled by a massive domestic market, and staffed by millions of engineers who've been radicalized by American hostility. Sanctions didn't create a dependency, they revealed that dependency could be overcome. this isn't just about China. The entire global semiconductor ecosystem is convulsing because of these sanctions, and the ripple effects are reshaping the industry in ways Washington didn't anticipate. Let's start with the CHIPS Act. $52 billion to lure Taiwanese and Korean manufacturers to build fabs in Arizona. Sounds smart, right? Bring cutting-edge manufacturing back to U.S. soil. But there's a problem. Those fabs won't be fully operational until 2028 at best, and they're massively over budget. The first TSMC Arizona fab has already seen its cost balloon from $12 billion to $25 billion. Meanwhile, SMIC is building 3 new fabs in China at breakneck speed with essentially unlimited state funding. The timeline mismatch is crucial. China is mobilizing now while the U.S. is still in the planning phase. By the time those Arizona fabs come online, they might be producing outdated chips compared to what China is making domestically. The U.S. could spend $50 billion to build the equivalent of a cutting-edge factory in 2025 that produces 2023's technology in 2028. Then there's the talent drain. Taiwanese semiconductor engineers are getting poached by Chinese firms offering 3x salaries. Taiwan's own chip industry is facing a brain drain because the mainland can pay more and offer more ambitious projects. The irony is that by sanctioning China, the U.S. is inadvertently hollowing out Taiwan's tech ecosystem, the same ecosystem they're trying to protect. The equipment manufacturers are caught in the middle. ASML can sell EUV machines to everyone except China, but China was projected to be 40% of their market by 2030. That's not a market you can just write off. So ASML is seeing its growth forecasts slashed, its stock price hammered, while Chinese competitors like SMEE are getting massive state funding to build a domestic alternative. In 5 years, ASML might not just have lost the Chinese market, they might have created a Chinese competitor that can sell to everyone else at lower prices. The same goes for US chip designers. Nvidia, Qualcomm, AMD, these companies get 20 to 30% of their revenue from China. When Washington restricts what they can sell, they don't just lose that revenue. They lose the scale economies that fund R&D. Nvidia's latest AI chips cost billions to design. If you shrink their addressable market by 30%, you either have to raise prices elsewhere or cut R&D, which slows innovation. It's a self-inflicted wound. Meanwhile, Chinese smartphone brands, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, have gone from 40% global market share to over 55% in 3 years. Why? They can source Chinese-made chips reliably without worrying about entity list surprises. Samsung and Apple are losing ground in the world's biggest markets because their supply chains are vulnerable to geopolitics. The global semiconductor supply chain is bifurcating. There's the US-aligned bloc, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Netherlands, and the China-aligned ecosystem. Increasingly, they don't talk to each other. This is expensive, inefficient, and creates massive duplication. But it's also inevitable. Once Washington decided chips were a national security issue rather than a commercial product, the long-term cost is staggering. We're looking at 2 parallel chip industries, each costing hundreds of billions, each suboptimal, but each self-sufficient. The consumer pays more, innovation slows globally because researchers can't collaborate, but national security concerns trump economic efficiency. And here's the dialectical twist. The U.S. attempt to preserve its technological lead is actually accelerating the end of its technological leadership. By forcing China to build independent capacity, Washington is creating a competitor that doesn't need American inputs at all. Once China can make 3nm chips without U.S. tech, why would they ever go back? Why would they respect U.S. patents? Why wouldn't they flood global markets with cheaper alternatives and undercut the very companies the sanctions were meant to protect? The chip world of 2030 will look nothing like the chip world of 2020. And it'll be shaped more by the unintended consequences of sanctions than by any strategic plan from Washington or Beijing. Alright, time for the big picture. Why did this happen? Why does containment keep backfiring? The answer is dialectical materialism, but I'll translate it into normal human. Capitalism has a contradiction at its core. It tries to maximize profit through global division of labor, but it also tries to maintain political control through national power. These two impulses are incompatible. The U.S. semiconductor industry pioneered globalized production. Design in California, fab in Taiwan, equipment from the Netherlands, raw materials from Japan. This was incredibly profitable because each country contributed its comparative advantage. But it also created vulnerabilities. What if Taiwan gets blockaded? What if China gains too much influence? So Washington tries to reassert control, to reshore production, to weaponize interdependence. But here's the dialectical insight. The attempt to solve a contradiction at one level creates a more intense contradiction at another level. By weaponizing chip supply chains, the U.S. transforms a commercial relationship into a security imperative for China. And security imperatives mobilize resources in ways that commercial incentives never could. China spent $150 billion on semiconductors before sanctions. After sanctions, they allocated another $150 billion just for the next 2 years. They've effectively declared a tech war economy. And war economies don't care about quarterly profits or market efficiency. They care about survival. They'll spend infinite money, waste infinite resources, accept infinite inefficiencies to achieve the objective. The U.S. mistake was thinking China would act like a rational market actor and accept permanent subordination. But no major power behaves that way when its core interests are threatened. The UK didn't accept German dominance in 1914. The U.S. didn't accept Soviet missiles in Cuba in 1962. And China isn't accepting a permanent tech blockade in 2025. Another dialectical principle: quantity becomes quality. China graduating 4 million STEM students per year isn't just a number. At that scale, it becomes a material force that can brute force problems that seem unsolvable. They can throw 10,000 engineers at a lithography problem and iterate until it works. Western firms can't match that scale because they're optimizing for profit, not national survival. The sanctions also created what Marxists call a united front. Before 2018, Chinese tech firms were bitter rivals. Alibaba versus Tencent, Huawei versus Xiaomi. Now, they're all on team defeat American containment. They share resources, coordinate with the state, accept lower profits for strategic goals. The external threat unified the ecosystem. Capitalism needs markets. When you close the market, you don't kill the producer, you create a new market. That's what happened here. China went from being a consumer of U.S. semiconductors to a competitor in the span of 5 years because Washington closed access. There's also the issue of technological determinism versus social relations. The U.S. thought their tech inherently superior, that Chinese engineers could never replicate it without American genius. But technology is social. It's about organization, resources, iteration. Give 4 million engineers $150 billion and a national mandate, and they'll solve problems. The iPhone wasn't magic, it was the product of massive capital investment and iterative improvement. China is now replicating that process, the final dialectical twist, the negation of the negation again. The U.S. chip industry was built on government contracts, Cold War defense spending, then became hyper-commercialized and globalized. Now U.S. policy is forcing it back into a national security framework. But in doing so, they're creating a Chinese industry that's also national security driven, but with more resources and a larger domestic market. The original U.S. advantage, commercial flexibility and global integration, is being negated by its own policies. The semiconductor industry is reverting from a globalized network to competing national blocks. But in that reversion, China is gaining advantages that the U.S. can't match because it still has to pretend it's playing by market rules while China is openly playing by war rules. You can't maintain a commercial lead when your competitor is playing for national survival. The stakes are different. The resource allocation is different, the risk tolerance is different. A Silicon Valley startup that fails goes bankrupt. A Chinese state-backed chip company that fails gets more funding to try again. The incentives are fundamentally misaligned. This is why tech supremacy isn't a permanent state. It's a momentary advantage that depends on specific historical conditions. Those conditions, globalization, interdependence, U.S. hegemony, are breaking down. And as they break down, New conditions emerge where different forms of organization become more effective, Silicon Valley optimized for innovation and profit. China is optimizing for resilience and sovereignty. In a world of geopolitical fragmentation, resilience beats innovation if that innovation is fragile. So where does this leave us? The US semiconductor industry isn't going to collapse tomorrow. Intel, Qualcomm, Nvidia, these are still powerful, innovative companies with deep expertise and massive market share. But their window of unchallenged dominance is closing fast, and it's closing because of choices Washington made. The CHIPS Act might bring some fabs back to Arizona, but those fabs will be expensive, slow to ramp, and producing technology that's already outdated by the time they come online. Meanwhile, China's new fabs are being built at a rate of 1 per quarter, each one getting closer to the cutting edge. Within 5 years, China will likely achieve parity in logic chips. Within 10, they could be leading in some categories, maybe not the most advanced processors, but the ones that matter for AI training, for electric vehicles, for IoT devices. The volume markets where scale matters more than absolute performance, and here's the thing. Once China can supply its own 1.4 billion consumers without US chips, what happens to American companies? They lose 30% of their revenue. They have to raise prices in remaining markets. They have to cut R&D. They enter a slow decline while Chinese competitors, flush with domestic cash, start undercutting them globally. We're looking at a potential repeat of what happened to Japanese electronics in the 1980s and 2000s, but this time it's US chip companies losing to Chinese competitors who were essentially incubated by American sanctions. The geopolitical implications are massive. Chips are the new oil. They power everything: AI, military tech, economic competitiveness. Whoever controls chip production controls the 21st century. The US tried to lock in permanent control. Instead, they accelerated the creation of a peer competitor, the Silicon Valley model: venture capital, rapid iteration, globalized supply chains, winner-take-all markets, work brilliantly in a unipolar world. It doesn't work in a multipolar world where supply chains are weapons and national security trumps profit. China's model, state-directed, massively funded, captive domestic market, long-time horizons, isn't as innovative in the short term, but it's far more resilient. And resilience is what matters when the system is fragmenting. The irony is that US policymakers understood this at some level. That's why they sanctioned China in the first place. They saw the threat coming. But they fundamentally misunderstood what sanctions would do. They thought they could freeze China's development in place. Instead, they pressed the fast-forward button. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. China now has multiple 7nm fabs, domestic equipment manufacturers, a talent pipeline of millions of engineers, and a national consensus that tech independence is existential. Even if Washington lifted every sanction tomorrow, China wouldn't go back to dependence. They've tasted sovereignty, and they're not giving it up. The US will likely respond with more sanctions, more restrictions, more attempts to slow China's progress. But each restriction will just accelerate the indigenization process. It's a feedback loop, and it's running away from Washington's control. For 70 years, Silicon Valley was the epicenter of technological progress. That era is ending, not because Silicon Valley failed, but because geopolitics made the valley's model untenable. The future of semiconductors will be bipolar at best, Chinese-dominated at worst, and the craziest part? It didn't have to be this way. If the US had accepted China's rise as a competitive partner rather than an existential threat, they'd still be selling chips, still making profits, still leading innovation. But by choosing containment, they forced China to become a competitor. The dialectic strikes again. The semiconductor war isn't over. It'll rage for decades. But the outcome is already becoming clear: a world where tech supremacy is contested, where no single country holds a veto over the global supply chain, and where Silicon Valley is just one player among many, not the undisputed champion. The sanctions that were meant to preserve American hegemony will be remembered as the policy that ended it. Not overnight. Not cleanly. But inevitably. So there you have it. The story of how the US tried to kneecap China's semiconductor industry and instead created a monster that might just win the race. It's a perfect case study in what happens when you apply linear solutions to complex systems. You get nonlinear blowback that we covered a lot today. From ASML's EUV machines to SMIC's multi-patterning breakthroughs, from the CHIPS Act's slow ramp to China's war economy mobilization. But the core lesson is simple. Complex systems adapt to pressure in ways you can't predict, and containment strategies almost always accelerate the thing they're trying to prevent. Think about the scale of miscalculation here. The US spent decades building a globalized semiconductor ecosystem because it was profitable and efficient. Then in a span of 5 years, they shattered it because of national security fears. But in trying to preserve their lead, they gave China the existential motivation to build a parallel system. It's like burning down your own house to keep warm. The implications go way beyond chips. This is about whether any single country can maintain a permanent veto over global technology. And the answer, increasingly, is no. The multipolar world isn't coming. It's here. If you found this breakdown useful, smash that like button. Drop a comment. Do you think Silicon Valley can maintain its lead, or is China's state-driven model the future of tech? And if you disagree, tell me why. I'm always down for a good debate. The next episode, how the fentanyl crisis is actually reorganizing the entire drug trade in Mexico and Latin America, turning cartels into chemical corporations, making violence more transactional than ideological, and why U.S. interdiction efforts keep creating more powerful trafficking networks. It's the story of how trying to cut off the supply of a single drug accidentally built a hyper-efficient, vertically integrated narcotics industry that's now exporting to 30 countries. Stay skeptical. Stay curious. Peace.